Hello. In this philosophy video, we're going to consider the beliefs that we hold and often the authority behind them and whether or not they're warranted. And we're going to look at two separate figures, G.W. Foote and al-Ghazali. And I think this is going to be pretty interesting. I haven't really seen these two figures placed side by side before. And a question we can ask is, can an unabashed atheist, that would be G.W. Foote, and a devout Muslim, al-Ghazali, find some common ground? So there's a question that we'll look at. We'll try to answer as we go through this presentation. Okay, let's start with G.W. Foote, George William Foote. He lived from 1850 to 1915. He was British. He was an atheist. He was a secularist. He believed in strict division between government and religion. And he was a free thinker. In fact, he ran a magazine called The Free Thinker. And it attacked religion and it used editorial cartoons. And some of them were pretty harsh. So there's Foote. He actually went to prison for a year because of the work he did for this magazine, The Free Thinker. He was charged with blasphemy, and his case was really important because up until that point, there was not really a distinction between British laws that governed something like blasphemy and religious laws. And so his case led to that distinction, and for new laws being written into British law covering blasphemy. Okay, the reading I'm basing this off of is from the beginning of a book that Foote wrote called Infidel Deathbeds. Pretty interesting title, and he chose that title because it's actually a book that's a response to another book by a Reverend Erskine Neal, who wrote a book called Closing Scenes. Closing Scenes was a book that was meant to try to bring people back to religion by showing them a series, this is all written, a series of scenes of people who had lost their faith or were atheists, and how at the end of life, right, their closing scene on their deathbed, they all of a sudden realize the error in their ways and to try to help other people not wait so long. So Closing Scenes came out. It was actually a big success. A lot of people bought it. It went through a few editions, and it turns out that some of the accounts of these deaths were not true. In fact, one of them was about a philosopher, David Hume, and it made up stuff about what he went through in those last weeks, those last moments. We know that because he had friends who were with him during that time who wrote about it. And so we sort of have a good idea of the closing scene for Hume, and it wasn't what was in this book. So Foote said, you know what? I'm going to write my book like Closing Scenes, these deathbeds of infidels, and I'm going to try to be more accurate. Okay, this is an old book. You can find it anywhere online. If you just do some searching, there you can get a copy. Okay, and also Closing Scenes is you can find that in places like Project Gutenberg. So did I cover everything I wanted? Yes. All right, so let's talk about some important points. One of the phrases that Foote uses in his introduction to the book is he talks about the geographical accident of their birth. And he's trying to get at the fact that, well, we don't choose where we're born, but there's a strong correlation between where we're born, what family we're born into, what culture we're born to, what religion we're born into. There's a big correlation between that information and what beliefs we hold. one of the things we can say is, depending on where we are, what's popular in our home or in our community or in our country, what's a popular idea that most people hold, well, it makes sense that other people would feel comfortable in that group holding those ideas. You can go back to a fallacy of thinking ad populum, right? There's pressure, there's persuasion for you to conform to the rest of the group. Okay, but regardless of where that belief came from, are you able to justify it? Is it a justified belief, or is it just a belief you hold because of the accident of where you were born? Well, Foote says, it makes sense when you're young to just copy the beliefs of your parents. You're a sponge. You absorb it all. You absorb more than you even realize as you're growing up from the environment around you. So it makes sense that people would have those beliefs. And it also makes sense that Foote would call it accidental, because we can't choose where we're born, who our parents are, what their religion is, what their culture is, all these things that factor into a lot of the beliefs we hold. So it is, in that sense, by accident that you were born with the parents you were born with, the culture you were born into, not by choice. Therefore, it's accident. Now, when you're young, you also don't really have the development of your brain to really be thorough in rational thought and reason. That's why children, we don't hold them to the same sort of accountability as an adult, right? We know that they're still figuring things out. They're still learning how to reason, how to make good decisions, how to make justified decisions. So, as a child, you absorb, and you shouldn't really be expected to be able to reason and justify those beliefs. But as you grow up, as you mature, in fact, when you reach college level, when you reach that age, you really start to have a mature brain, right? And maybe some of you are younger and you say, I'm pretty mature. It's just a matter of biology. It takes a long time to fully develop, and everybody's a little bit different, so there's no exact age when someone has a completely mature brain. And you also need education, right? You need to learn the skills of reasoning. You need to learn how to figure out what the structure of an argument is, what sort of persuasion is fallacious, a fallacy, and should be resisted. All these things take education and time. So probably you are around that age where you could use your brain to figure out if you can justify the beliefs you have. Okay, Foote goes through and he is criticizing some religious persuasion and making arguments for people to come back into religion or to have faith or to give up atheism. And some of the things he points out are that who are you choosing to persuade, right? If you're choosing just people who are extremely old and can't no longer have the ability to have focused thought, right, then you're trying to avoid reason. If you choose someone who's in extreme pain, such that pain sort of short circuits any sort of chance they have to exercise rational thought, then you're avoiding sort of the whole process of justifying. The person can't do it, right? If you choose someone who's extremely vulnerable or desperate, right, they might be willing to set aside reason and not justify beliefs. And emotion. If you're able to play on someone's emotion, tap into their emotion, it might overwhelm them and short circuit rational thought. So those are some things that Foote points out. And if we look at some specific fallacies that might come up, there's the appeal to emotion And one of the things Foote talks about is when, someone's making an argument, if they sort of appeal to moments in your childhood where you're innocent and you're happy, and you try to attach that to a belief that you'll have the same feeling of happiness, that's sort of trying to not prove something's right, but just try to make someone feel good and persuade them for that reason. Appeal to bribery, right? If you offer someone a reward in order for them to agree that something's true, that's a fallacy. So if you look at something like the offer of an eternal reward, like paradise, for one's faith or belief, then Foote's saying that is not justification, right? That person hasn't justified it. They're just, maybe they can practically justify it, but in terms of whether or not it's true or not, right, it shouldn't be convincing. And same thing with appeal to violence, right? If you're being threatened with a punishment to come to the conclusion something's true, that also is not a good reason to ascertain the truth of a claim. And finally, there's an appeal to ignorance, right? If you are making an argument that something must be true because you can't prove it isn't true, right? That's not enough. Okay, so if we take Foote's argument, we could actually go and place it into the structure of the Rogerian method of organizing an argument. This is pretty interesting. The Rogerian method is listed on the Purdue University OWL site, the online writing lab, and so go check that out if you haven't yet. It's a really great resource for organizing your writing, making a well-made, persuasive, and logical argument. So here's one of the ways you can go about making an argument, and actually Foote's argument kind of fits nicely into this. This is the one where you're really trying to use psychology to help be persuasive. So you introduce your issue, what beliefs should we hold, then you go first to the opposing view, right? And you try to present that in a neutral way, that there are popular cultural family beliefs that most people hold their entire lives. And then in this method, you actually try to talk about why that's valid, why that makes sense, and what sort of context it makes sense. And it does make sense because when you're born, right, all you can really do is sort of absorb beliefs. And so it makes sense that you would absorb those beliefs, and many of them you would hold the rest of your life. Here is Foote's statement of position, right? One should use logic to turn our beliefs into justified conclusions that are based or supported by facts and principles. Right? So there's his position. And then he's going to provide his context. He's going to say, after a period of maturing, we have the ability to reason for ourselves, right? We're able to reason. Why not use it? If it was given to us, right, then it was given to us to be used. And finally, the statement of benefit. Your beliefs will be stronger on a more solid ground if you can justify them, right? A justified belief is one that you can feel more confident about than one in which you hold, which you're not able to support or defend. Okay, so that's pretty interesting. We can put Foote's argument into this Rogerian method. Okay, and here's like the question in the shadows about philosophy often. Foote's an atheist. Is philosophy really just, a way to attack religion, to pull people away from religion? Right? And we can try to answer that question in many different ways. We could say yes, philosophy is devoted to reason and to sort of a rational approach, and that if that's the only approach that you allow, it would deny you from other ways of thinking about the world, other ways of holding beliefs, things like faith. On the other hand, right, maybe philosophy is not a pathway towards atheism. In fact, right? Wouldn't someone, a person of faith, who is able to defend their beliefs, have a stronger faith? So Foote doesn't say like what you should end up, what beliefs you should end up with. He's just saying you should be able to defend them, and that when you reach a certain age, you're able to do that. You can reason for yourself and come up with why you believe something. If you don't have beliefs to support something, then you need to be honest about that. Okay, let's go to al-Ghazali. Now, al-Ghazali was way before Foote, right? He lived approximately 1058 to 1111. This is in CE. Okay, so al-Ghazali is a really important figure, right? He is a very religious man. He's Muslim. He's Persian, lives where today is Iran. He's a philosopher, a theologian, a Sufi mystic. He is really a master in many different disciplines, an incredible person. He was known as Hujjat al-Islam, which translates into, I've seen it translated as proof of Islam or authority of Islam. And he was given this title, and he may have been one of the first people to be given this title, as others who have been given it, in honor of his writings, his religious journey. And he goes through a period of questioning, of doubt, of skepticism, and he comes back. He works through it. And he develops ways to support his beliefs, particularly against some of the Hellenistic and Aristotelian influenced thinkers and theologians in his time. There was a lot of back and forth with thinkers who were sort of in the tradition of Aristotle, who was translated into Arabic and was studied for a long period of time in the culture, in sort of Arabic academia. And actually, we only have Aristotle in today because of that. Much of Aristotle was lost, and it was only later on that it was discovered there were these Arabic translations, and they were translated from Arabic into Latin, into some of the other languages of the time. Okay, so let's move on. And particularly what I'm looking at here is a text that al-Ghazali wrote that's called Deliverance from Error. And it's autobiography. He's writing about this journey he took. And apparently it was written at some point in the last 5 years of his life. So he's looking back and he's writing this for others. He wrote in Arabic, but he also wrote in Persian. And Persian was a more common language for the community. And so, he's speaking to everybody to share his journey, and so that others might be able to gain something from it. This book is recommended by an American philosopher, William James, who's writing in the beginning of the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And he has a book called Varieties of Religious Experience, where he recommends this book because it so well gives you a window into the inner experience of this religion, which for William James was something very different than he knew. So he knew Christianity, and this was a window into Islam. Okay, so did a background. One of the things that al-Ghazali is setting out to do is to distinguish truth from error in his beliefs. Okay, I'm going to go through like a few quotes from, and I'm just looking at the beginning of the text. It's not a really long text, but this is just intro. Okay, so here is one paragraph right at the beginning. You wish to know the daring it took to rise above the plane of conformism, taqlid, to the heights of observation and independent investigation. First, what profit I drew at the beginning from Kalam, or theology. Secondly, how I then turned away from those who defended Talim, teaching, because they were impeded in reaching the truth by their subjection to an imam. Thirdly, how much I mistrusted the methods of philosophers. And finally, how I became to appreciate the way of Sufism. All right, there's a lot in that paragraph. And I just want to point out, how, in some ways, how radical this is. What he's telling us that we don't often hear. So he starts off talking about conformity, right? Conforming to the beliefs of those around him in his culture and his community. Then he's talking about studying from sort of theology, from those who are experts, right? His teachers, the imam. But he turns away from all of that, right? He wonders, right? Just on the authority of a teacher, is that enough to say it's right? Shouldn't I be able to understand and defend it myself? So, strong distrust from teachers, right? Your teacher usually doesn't come in and say, hey, don't trust me. But here's al-Ghazali saying, hey, if you really want to be able to defend your beliefs, don't just take it because somebody else said so. Right? And so he turns away from his teachers and what they say, and he goes to philosophy, trying to reason things through yourself. And he mistrusts those methods too, right? And he finally turns to Sufism. So there's a whole journey going on here. And it's very interesting how it all works together. I highly recommend checking this out. Okay, another quote. People have different religions and beliefs, that there are different theological systems among religious leaders, and that the community of Islam has different sects and paths. Yet each group believes it has found salvation. Right? So here al-Ghazali is openly saying, listen, there's all these different religions. Each religion has different beliefs, right? Different theological systems. They all have leaders that come out and are able to, and very persuasively explain them. On top of that, even within, something like a religion like Islam, there's lots of different sects. There's lots of different belief systems within a belief system, right? So it's complicated. What do we do? And the last thing he says is that everybody thinks they found salvation. What's salvation? The truth, right? So we have all these different beliefs, and everybody thinks they're right. What do you do in a situation like that? Another quote. And this one actually includes a quote from the Quran. So I perceive that Christian children grew up as Christians, young Jews grew up in Judaism, and young Muslims in Islam. It is one's parents who make one into a Jew, a Christian, or a Magian. Okay, so let's unpack that. It's an observation, right? It's an observation about where we get our beliefs from, right? And that each person, depending on who their parents are, what sort of culture they grow up in, what household they grow up in, they become devout, many, in that belief system, right? So it's pretty interesting that in realizing that, right, if that's the reason why you believe something is true is because you feel really strongly about it and you're devout and your parents brought you up that way, well, other people with opposing belief systems, sometimes conflicting, had the same reason for their beliefs. So it would justify everything. Interesting. So just because your parents had a belief system that you absorbed, that's not enough to defend it. Everybody else is that way too. The word Magian, some of you may not be familiar, that is a word for a follower or a priest of Zoroastrianism, which was a very ancient Iranian religion, one of the oldest known organized religions. So, and when al-Ghazali is living, in Persia, in what today is Iran, it was a very multicultural, very diverse community. And so he was greatly aware of all these different religions and cultures. What's really neat is we finally found our connection to Foote. There is common ground, right? Because it's sort of by accident who your parents are. You don't choose your parents. You just end up in that family. So, at least from your perspective, it's by accident. So, are your beliefs held just due to geographical accident, or can you justify them? All right, another quote. An interior force drove me to research the reality of original human nature, and that of the beliefs which derive from conformism to the authority of parents and teachers. I tried to discern among the elements which are taught by rote and accepted without question, which discrimination gives rise to so much controversy regarding what is true and what is false. Okay, so one of the first steps that al-Ghazali takes is he starts to go through and look at all his beliefs and try to characterize them, right? Which beliefs are just because of conformity, the culture that I grew up and as a part of? Which ones are based on authority, right? The authority of my parents or authority figures that are in my environment. And which ones are ones I've never thought about trying to justify? They remain unjustified for me. So he kind of, in a way, catalogs all his beliefs and is going to see which ones he then can defend, if he can defend them. All right. So I'm just going to do a little bit about the rest of the work. But I'm going to leave it a lot up to you to go out and explore all this that I introduce in these videos and in my classes. So, al-Ghazali is aiming for knowledge and certainty. In Western philosophy, this should really line up with somebody who comes centuries later, René Descartes. Right? We can really find a lot of connections between al-Ghazali and a work like Meditations on First Philosophy by Descartes. The role of doubt, right? He's lost in doubt now because he realizes that he holds many of his ideas and he holds them very strongly, right? But he can't defend them, right? It's due to him being born mainly into that family, that culture, that religion. So the role of doubt arises and sends him on this journey. And he tries to figure out how he can dispel that doubt. One of the things he considers is, well, when I see something, when I use my senses, right, then I know it's real. I've confirmed it. I've verified it. So perhaps I'll use my senses to try to dispel this doubt. But then he realizes that, I see things and I come to certain conclusions based on that sensory experience. And it turns out when I reason about it, it's wrong. And one of the things he brings up is sort of the size of celestial objects. They look very small. When you look up in the sky, the moon, you can fit it between your fingers. He says, but using reason, I know that that's actually a very large object and that things that are very far away just appear smaller in our vision. So maybe sensory experience is not the best way always to achieve knowledge and certainty. All right, maybe it's reason. Maybe reason alone is how we attain knowledge and certainty and are able to justify our beliefs in a way that we can truly be confident in them. And I'm sort of going to leave you here. I'm going to give you a sense of where al-Ghazali goes in his journey. But one of the analogies he uses is, and when he's sort of thinking about the difference between truth and falsity in our beliefs, is the difference between being awake and being asleep and dreaming. Right? When you dream, everything that's happening isn't really happening. It's false. When you wake up, you realize that that was false. And some of those dreams can seem very real while they're happening. And it's only later when you awaken that you realize, oh, wow, I'm sweaty. It seemed real, but it wasn't real. It was a dream. So reason sort of acts like waking up to perhaps some of the illusion of sensory experience. And so al-Ghazali wonders, is there something in reason that is also kind of like dreaming that's false? And is there another experience like waking that would awaken me to that? And this is when he turns to mysticism and Sufism to think about that experience and what that allows him to realize after going through those sorts of experiences. So we can think of skepticism as an ailment. We don't have to, but that's one way we can think of it. If we do, what would be the cure, right? And is there ultimately a deliverance from error? Because if a mystical experience might awaken us to issues with reason, rational experience, then might there be another experience that would awaken us? Will this have any ending? Will there be any point where we end, or could it go on forever? I don't know. I'm going to leave it here, and hopefully you'll think more about this.